So it's a matter of what are the qualities in a human being that you value and what are the qualities that you don't. And I think that those are critical factors in all of our interactions and in all of our transactions.
Welcome to the Get Traction podcast. If you are ready to learn exactly what it takes to become a real estate entrepreneur, this is the show for you. With your host, founder of Traction Real Estate Mentors and president of the Traction Real Estate Investors Association, Tom Zeeb.
Welcome back. Excited to be opening up season 2 of the Get Traction podcast. We've got a fantastic show for you today. So first off, on the line, as always, is my producer, Harry Duran. Hey, Harry.
Hey, Tom. Excited to kick off this new season.
Likewise, good to be back. So, and also, one of the reasons this is such a special episode is we have a very special guest. We have Emily Gumpert, who's been my settlement attorney for, probably longer than we all care to talk about. So, Emily, are you on the line?
I am indeed, and I agree.
Fantastic. So, Emily, real estate settlement attorney. So, and I've alluded to how long we've worked together. How long have you been a real estate attorney?
Well, I've been in the real estate industry way longer than I was a real estate attorney. But I was a real estate attorney pretty much from you've got me. Let's put it this way. I got involved in real estate as an agent and then a broker back in the 1980s. Then I went to law school and got out of law school in 1995. And I practiced a variety of types of law for maybe 2 or 3 years. And then I realized what really had my biggest interest in where I could walk away from a table feeling everybody had won instead of you had one winner and one loser. So it would have probably been in the late 1990s that I started doing real estate settlements. But of course, I had been extremely familiar with them for all of my years as a real estate agent and broker.
Got you. Yeah, I know. I met you in the early 2000s. And do you remember how we met? Because there's a good lesson. Nope. You were one of my buyer's attorneys, and I was in between attorneys at the time, and I needed a new attorney, and I told my buyer, I said, who do you use? He said, I use Emily. I said, all right, I'll tell you what, on this next deal, I didn't have anyone else lined up. I said, let's use Emily. And I recognized that you wouldn't view me as much as the main client as your buyer who you worked with all the time. It took a while before we were able to develop that.
Tom, I do not remember. I guess it's because you and I have known each other for so long now that you're the shining light. Do you remember who that other person was?
I do. It was Ken.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Top buyers for a long time.
Moving right along.
Yeah, exactly. He introduced me to you, and it worked out very well. We had a lot of good, lot of good transactions. The three of us wound up being involved in.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm wondering. I'm thinking of a couple of interesting things. I know different parts of the country they call people who settle deals by different names. You know, in the DC area, we tend to say settlement attorney or the settlement company. Out west, they say escrow officer or close escrow. Sometimes it's settlement. It's different in every state and every region. What's the difference? What are some of the different terms out there that people need to be familiar with?
Oh gosh, well, I think you've just really covered them all. Settlement agent, settlement attorney. Here in Oregon, the person who does the settlement is not required to be an attorney. And that's generally the case pretty much throughout, although there are some exceptions, New York being one of them, and there may very well be others that I'm not aware of. But here, settlement agent, settlement officer, escrow officer, the term officer is used frequently. But essentially, though, they're all doing the same thing, and that is making sure that the documents are properly prepared and properly recorded. And what those documents are, of course, is going to be a function of the type of transaction. Does that answer your question?
That sure does. So in a basic real estate transaction that an investor would do, I'm focusing mostly on wholesaling. So when I assign a contract from a motivated seller to a buyer, either a landlord buyer or a rehab buyer, what documents does the settlement agent have to deal with?
Well, the single most important thing is going to be not the single most, the two single most important documents will be the initial contract of sale between you and the seller, and then the agreement between you and the person to whom, or the party, it doesn't have to be a person, to whom you are transferring your rights. Because those two documents are going to spell out in detail exactly how the transaction is going to proceed.
Gotcha. So as the wholesaler, it's my initial contract with the seller. And then as a wholesaler, it's my assignment contract to the ultimate end buyer.
Exactly.
And any other?
And you do a pretty good job, I might add.
Yeah, thanks. It's always been good. Well, I had very good legal help with many of my contracts.
Flattery gets you everywhere.
It's true. It's kept me solid and safe for years. I mean, we certainly had some ups and downs on various contracts. There's always a couple, a settlement that might throw you for a loop, or some interesting issues that come up.
The thing I think that most people forget is that it's not just between you and either your assignee or you and your seller. There are federal agencies and regulations that change. And what might be perfectly acceptable on day one may not be acceptable. In fact, may put you at risk on day two because of the change in the rules or the regulations. If my memory serves, one of the big issues was the use of the term flip, which was in constant use and common usage. And basically it was, a person who has a contract to buy, and then they assign that right to a third party, and that was called the flip. Somewhere back in the early 2000s, I believe, and I can't trust my memory on this, but I do know that the Federal Housing Agency described flip in a way and made it unlawful. So the term as it had been used could no longer be used, because basically what you're then saying is I've committed a crime. So stuff like that happens all the time. And it's really essential for your attorney, whoever it may happen to be aware of those changes to protect all the parties involved.
Got you. Do you have any other examples of kind of that shifting legal environment screwing things up for us investors?
Not off the top of my head, although I do know one area that's always questionable is the percentage of the value of the difference between your contract sales price and your assignment fee. When that gets to be too high, it can raise questions to some third party who may happen to just be aware of it. And it puts people at risk for conceivably defrauding the seller. It's subtle and it's tricky, and I can't give you a figure right now. But that's always something to be aware of.
So being aware of what percentage of the overall difference in value is the wholesale fee?
Exactly.
But there's no hard and fast rule of thumb.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Now remember, I'm retired. I know it's not for very long, but things happen. As I say, changes occur every day. And that's why it's critical to make sure that your attorney is on top of all of those things.
Gotcha. What are you comfortable with then? If there's no hard and fast rule, there's no hard and fast percentage number. Well, what are you personally comfortable with?
I'm thinking between 10 and maybe 15% max. Anything more than that kind of raises questions. One of the things that I can remember is that the seller sometimes in the early days when these kinds of transactions were being initiated, that the seller really did not know, and in many cases They were two separate transactions. Seller sold to the wholesaler, and it was a complete transaction, and then the wholesaler sold to the next party.
Mm-hmm.
That stopped for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least that one of them was the actual funds available sometimes would not come until the second transaction. And so that already reeks of, some issues. How can a settlement attorney or a settlement agent testify that the funds were, from buyer, i.e. wholesaler, to seller, were there at the table when in fact they weren't until that second transaction. And the other piece, of course, is when you have two separate transactions, they're taxed separately, and that takes a big chunk out of the transaction. So I think that that kind of is where the issues became so pointed that it went from being two transactions to one. And then as soon as that one transaction happened, the wholesaler's skill is in explaining to the seller the difference between the amount of funds coming on the table and the amount of funds that are going directly to the seller. And that, I will say, is one of the areas where I have admired your knowledge, your skill, and your grace in doing that. It's a remarkable talent.
How so exactly? Explain that for people.
Well, okay, so here I am. I'm a seller, and I have made a contract with you for $100,000. And now I'm sitting at the table, and there's $115,000. Well, wait a minute. Where is that 15,000? I don't understand. I have heard the skills with which you have explained. This is not just my profit. That's one small piece of it. This has been as a result of my efforts to market, to try to find the perfect buyer who was going to do with your property what you had ultimately hoped you could do, and all of the other bits and pieces, many of which are very specific to the circumstances of the seller. And I wouldn't necessarily know what these are. I certainly can't abstractly think about them. But I have been very acutely aware of how much of a challenge it can be, because sellers go, well, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. What's going on? Why am I not getting all of that? So I think it becomes, sometimes the settlement attorney or the settlement agent, him or herself, is somewhat taken aback that this hasn't been explained beforehand. And I have, never with you, but I have seen other occasions where the wholesaler has sort of expected the attorney to step in and do their best to explain. And my feeling is, hey, that's not my job, So I'm delighted that has never been my job when you and I have had transactions.
Yeah,
and I think you can understand why that's not the responsibility of the settlement agent.
Oh, totally. No, it's completely on the investor, because one thing I teach people is the relationship is between you and the motivated seller. They don't know the attorney. They don't know the buyer. And most people buy and sell a house maybe twice in their life. So to get like overly complex or overly complicated just introduces fear and being scary. So just explain it to them. Like I'm a wholesaler. I represent a group of buyers. Some are going to fix the property up and resell it. Others are going to hang on to it as a rental property. I'm going to match you with the one that is best. And then it's really easy to explain what happens at settlement. And I say, my fee, they say, what's that? In your example, is $15,000. What's that $15,000? So that's one of the ways we pull some money out of the deal to make it happen.
Exactly.
So all of which is perfect true. And I've never found the need to, I know a lot of people are worried about hiding their fee. I have never had the need to hide my fee by doing a double closing, which is what you explained earlier. So, two separate transactions. I've always just flat out revealed exactly what I'm doing and had it on the settlement sheet, because to me, there's nothing wrong and there's nothing to hide.
Exactly.
Now, when I'm thinking of doing things right like that, another big piece of the puzzle is making sure you have escrow money down on the deal. Make sure you have put some money down to bind your contract. Why is that important, Counselor?
Well, without consideration, there is no deal. It's as simple as that. There is no contract formed unless there is consideration. So you and I may have an agreement, and we may have an agreement in writing, but without that deposit, escrow money, however you want to describe it, in general, it's called consideration in the law. Without that consideration, then there is no deal. And so your seller can walk and you're done.
So the signature alone, no matter how strong the contract is, and no matter how fresh the ink is on the signature, it's meaningless if you don't bother to bind the contract with some consideration money.
Exactly. Now, having said that, and being the lawyer that I am, even if I'm not practicing, I have to say there are obviously going to be some exceptions, but they involve lawsuits.
Yes.
And then why bother? I mean, that's not what you want. You don't want to spend your life litigating, try to force a seller to come to the table, especially if you end up, even if you win, you've lost your time. It's taken forever, and you've probably spent more in legal fees than the initial contract called for. So yes, you've got to have that consideration.
Gotcha. Now, Emily, one thing that you've always taken very good care of me on is making sure that I'm protected, but also that kind of everybody in the deal is protected for the thing. You've always been conscious of taking care of all the parties. And you alluded to that earlier when you talked about how enjoyable it was to do win-win transactions. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I try. And the reason I think that's important is continuity, a future, a reputation. I mean, all of these, what I consider to be critical qualities of being a human being, are very important. You don't want to walk away from the table. Nobody wants to walk away from the table either feeling screwed over. You like that legal term, right? Or abused. Now, there definitely are people on this planet who like to walk away with I won and you lost. But that's actually why I got out of litigation and went back into real estate, because if you handle a transaction with the attitude that everybody's going to come out a winner, it affects the way you conduct the transaction, and everybody comes out feeling good. Now, how does this affect you? You know, what are the ramifications? Well, first of all, it's good for the settlement attorney, because then the buyer, the ultimate the assignee, oh, I like this attorney. I'm going to bring this person or this agent. I'm going to bring this person my business in the future. And then the wholesaler likes it, feels good. I like this. This deal went well. People feel good about it. I'm going to keep coming back to this person. The seller walks away feeling, I have been protected. This person is good. I will remember that. Don't know if I'm ever going to have the opportunity, but you never know. When a person asks, I'll have somebody I can recommend. So there's not just those three parties. There are the four parties. There's the settlement person is not really a part of the transaction in terms of those details, but a very important part of the transaction in terms of the human contact and the human interaction that's involved. We're not talking about big corporate sales here. We're talking about typically homeowners who are generally in some sort of distress. So I think it's very important to have a person walk away and feel good about what has happened. Corporations don't care.
No, it's very true. And I know it sounds a little schmaltzy, and it's wow, is it really win-win all around? But yes, I've always told people, you're not in this business to hurt people. You're not going to take advantage of anyone in a deal. It's when all parties agree. The seller is benefiting because you're getting them out from under their problem. You're making their problems and troubles go away, and your buyer is happy because they get a great deal on their hands that they can fix up and turn around and make a profit. And that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, it's a win all around. Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe there's very few things in life that truly are a win all around, but this is one of them, and it's one of the things I like about the business.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's one of the things I like about you.
Oh, well, thanks, Sam. If folks can't tell, we obviously have a close relationship, and it's good.
Let's put it this way. There are people who violate the precepts and standards that we've been talking about up until now in this conversation. People who have absolutely, I have had wholesalers smirk and denigrate the seller, saying, "What a jerk! They could have gotten so much more out of me if they had only, and that makes my skin crawl. It's that lack of respect that I have seen, and not only in the wholesaler, but sometimes in the assignee as well. And that I find very offensive. And I have, in fact, told some people that they really need to find somebody else to do their deals, because I do not wish to participate in any kind of a transaction where there is not that respect. Now, having said that, I can say that I have the capacity that the comfort to be able to say, I'm not interested in your business. Not everybody does. I don't know, Harry, if I answered your question or not, but that's the kind of thing that I would really want to stay away from.
Gotcha. Emily, how do you, because that brings up a good point. If we're trying to find a good settlement attorney, good settlement agent, good escrow officer, how do we start to develop that relationship with a new officer?
Well, I think the very first question, you've posed an interesting question too, Tom. I think the first question to ask is, first of all, have you done transactions of this type in the past? And if the answer is no, the next question would be, I don't think that should automatically exclude them, but the next question should be is, are you interested in learning how? Mm-hmm. Because the fact that I was an attorney, the fact that I had been a real estate agent and broker for 16 plus years prior to that time, didn't mean I know everything. I still don't know everything. And if an attorney or a settlement agent, escrow officer, however you wish to name that person, is not interested in learning new things, keep away. Okay, so if the person says, going back to the first question, have you ever done these transactions? And they go, oh yeah, I've done a few, I've done a couple, I've done 6, I've done 10, whatever. The next question then I would ask is, do you like them? Do you like doing it? And I think during the course of a conversation that you're having with this person, you'll get a sense of, do we have easy dialogue? Does is there a yin and a yang here? Is there a balance of my conversation, my question, his or her answers? Do we communicate easily? And if there is easy communication, give it a shot. I think that's the very best way to go about making a selection. And then you'll actually see during the transaction how that person behaves and how they bring their experience and to the table.
Got you. In fact, that reminds me of how I told you when we first met, but how I knew about you was from a previous transaction of that was getting into a little bit of trouble. My attorney, I won't mention any names, attorney at the time didn't really understand how to do this type of transaction, even though, massively experienced, but not with investor style transactions. And my buyer reached out to you, and you were on vacation at the time, but reached out to you to basically figure out how to save it. It saved it for both of us, saved it for me as a wholesaler, saved it for him as a buyer. And that was the first, and that's why then when I was in between attorneys, because of that, I said, let's use this Emily character and let's see how she is. You definitely turned out to be a character.
Well, one of the joys of having a healthy attitude, I think, is just that you can allow yourself You don't have to, there's no role that you have to fill except that of a peacemaker. I will say that over the course of my life, my professional and business life, I have had a variety of what I call tools. People ask me what I do or what I did when I was working, and I simply say, I am a social worker. I have many tools. I have a law degree. I had a broker's license, and I also, I don't know if you're aware of this, Tom, but I have a master's degree in health and hospital administration. So all of these things are really just tools to try to bring a positive outcome to whatever challenge you're faced with, whatever challenge you're given. So yes, I'm a character.
I say that in a good way.
Oh, so do I.
So we talked about some of the questions to ask people. Are they open to it? Do they want to learn? We can get that relationship going correctly. Let's flip that around though. How do I spot a bad one? Is it just that they don't have any open-mindedness to learning something new, or are there certain warning signs that might tell me I'm dealing with a bad attorney?
Well, there are a couple of pieces. Absolutely, the first time when someone says, no, I really am not interested, well, that would be enough for you to say, no, I'm not going to do it here. But if they say, oh, yeah, I'm interested, and then you go through the experience and you see that the person they're not answering questions at the settlement table with either confidence or comfort to the person who's asking the question. Now, sometimes this is based on lack of experience, but other times it's based upon the character of that person. Not that they're evil, but that they just don't have people skills. And I think, Tom, in this kind of a setting, you have to trust your own feelings. I mean, obviously, if someone says something really, really stupid, and everybody at the table knows it, and maybe even the person who said it, that's a clue that nobody could miss. But generally, I think there's a subtlety in terms of how people act, the way they speak, whether they're paying attention to the person who has asked the question, so that as they are responding to it, whether that person looks as though they're really getting it, and then caring to say, I'm not sure I explained that correctly. And that's another sort of example. Instead of telling somebody, well, you didn't do it right, the way to do it is to say, I don't think I answered your question correctly. Let me try again. Or is this what you wanted to ask me? And then rephrase the question in a way that that person will get it. And so if that's not what they really wanted, they'll be able to say, oh, no, what I really meant was such and such. So these are, I think, skills that you acquire as you mature, if you're lucky. Like a 21-year-old is not likely to have the same people skills, if you will, as a 31-year-old or a 41-year-old, 51-year-old, 61-year-old, 71-year-old, and I'm not going beyond that. Although I am beyond that. I don't know if that answers your question properly.
No, that does. And I would add, I mean, I do the same thing with doctors, and most people, I think it's a great skill, not just for picking out a real estate settlement attorney or an escrow officer, but just life in general. Anyone you have to deal with in a professional capacity, if they can't coolly and calmly answer your questions, if you can't see the gears moving in their head, if you can't sense that they actually understand what you're saying and are coming up with the right answer, then they're not the right person for you.
Exactly.
Exactly. Interesting.
And that's also true, I think, for people that you will be assigning to. Sometimes you meet someone and they're really interested, and you go through the transaction and you realize, this is really not the way I like doing business. And so you would just not really reach out to that person again. I don't know if you've ever experienced that.
A couple of times. There's been people I've
Okay.
promptly removed from the buyer's list, and or sometimes we just finished the transaction and it was like, great, wonderful. No, don't call us, we'll call you.
Exactly.
It's just, where I'm moving on because there's something I just don't like there. It happens because people are people.
Yeah.
Well, that brings me to a good question then. What are some of the things you dislike? I don't want to say hate, dislike about working with real estate investors. Some of the pet peeves you've had over the years.
I'm not going near that one with a 10-foot pole, Your Honor.
Fair enough.
Just briefly, I mean, and I think I mentioned this before. I mean, if somebody is arrogant, and this is not true only of investors, this is human qualities. Some people are arrogant. Some people want to walk away from the table, not just winning, but feeling that they bested everybody in that win, and having a certain attitude about that. I don't like that wherever I find it, whether it's in the buyer, the seller, the wholesaler, the attorney, for that matter. So it's a matter of, what are the qualities in a human being that you value, and what are the qualities that you don't? And I think that those are critical factors in all of our interactions and in all of our transactions. We can't always rely on them, because sometimes we won't know the answers until we've gone through a process with someone. There are people who do a pretty good job of hiding some of their basic instincts and basic character qualities, let's say, rather than defects. But after one or two transactions, you get a sense of whether a person is going to be upfront and going to be honest and going to be caring and careful and respectful. And if you've got those qualities, you're good to go. And if you don't, so long.
Yep.
That's my 10-foot pole.
I got you. It's interesting. Again, that's kind of a life lesson mixed in as well. Because I've one of the reasons I've been in this business for so long and enjoyed it and continue to find it fun is I've managed to filter out a lot of the jerks. I just don't. I have no interest in doing business with jerks. I found nothing that wears you out faster than having to constantly fight with people. So anyone's got too much fight in them, it's not worth it. There's plenty of people that actually want to do the business and do it right. Why focus on I could think of some worse words, but jerks.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly where I was going. Yeah.
It adds to a kind of a happiness and inner peace, sleep well at night. You don't feel beat up and worn out all the time.
Exactly. You want to be able to go home at the end of the day and feel that you've been a good human being. You've added something positive to the planet. You've enriched someone else's life, and your life has been enriched as well. Now, I understand that that's not always possible, but that's certainly what we want to strive for.
Yeah, not 100% of the time, but let's make it very healthy, at least 80% of the time.
As frequently as we can.
Absolutely. So how expensive is it to work with an attorney if you're a wholesaler?
Oh, gosh, I have no idea. I know that one of the things that my sister used to criticize me for was I would have conversations with clients and not bill them. Because most of the money that was generated through a transaction, quite frankly, comes from the title insurance. Now, this is something that probably, I don't know, if another attorney were the editor of this conversation, they might want to edit out. But
yeah, most people don't know that, but that's okay. Let's hear it.
The settlement attorney or the settlement agent, unless they are a salaried person from a larger company, and that salary would also be a function, I think, of how much business they generate. But the sale of title insurance, and I'm not deprecating this, mind you, I'm just explaining this because I think title insurance is critical, and if we want to go into that conversation, I'm more than happy to take that direction as well. But going back to your immediate point in terms of paying, how much should you pay? So a lot of attorneys, settlement agents, I don't think can do this, but a lot of attorneys will charge, in addition to whatever settlement fee there is, they will charge for conversations, legal advice they have given, even if it's in connection with this particular transaction. I did not do that unless there was some very compelling reason to do so, because I felt that, A, I want to be able to educate people as much as possible so that the next time they find themselves in a similar situation, they'll be able to navigate it with a little more discretion and a little more grace and a little more skill. So I'm not sure that I don't necessarily criticize attorneys who don't do it the way I did. All I know is that it didn't make sense to me to charge people on an hourly basis, so to speak, for advice that would be in the normal course of events from the inception of the transaction until the final closing. I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, because and just to clarify for everyone, the bulk of the money that a settlement company makes is the title insurance binder. They get to keep that, correct?
Right. Well, not the binder, the title insurance fee. The binder is
the title insurance fee.
Yeah.
Yeah, my bad on the terminology. Okay. So yeah, and that was it. That's why when I think about it in terms of, what have I paid you over the years as a wholesaler? You and the firms you work for made good money from the transactions that I brought to the table, although none of it was actually money out of my pocket, because the fees are being split between the buyer and the seller, of which I wound up being neither.
Mm-hmm.
And the bulk of the money is coming from the title insurance fee, which is an expense to the buyer as well. So I was kind of bringing the money to the table, but it wasn't my personal money as the wholesaler. So for me, that's one of the beautiful things about wholesaling.
Yeah. Have there been times when you have purchased property, I'm trying to remember, and then you did the development and resold it later on?
Occasionally. I tend to mostly wholesale it as I go. I'll do an occasional rehab, an occasional rental, but I primarily like to just assign my contracts and move on. So
did you, or do you think your listeners would have any interest in what title insurance really is and what it does?
It's both. Yeah, let's hear it. Like, you have kind of a, do a brief little seminar on it.
Well, a brief. Now you're asking me to be brief. Okay. Every jurisdiction, of course, is different. What title insurance essentially does is it tells your purchaser that I am insuring that you have full, complete, 100% claim on this piece of property. There is no one else who has a claim on it. And if there is, I will defend your rights to it. This seems like, what's the big deal? Well, here are some of the issues. Every state, well, not every state, most states, and certainly this is true in the District of Columbia and Maryland and Virginia as well, you had rules whereby a husband, a male, could own a piece of property, and if he were married, even if his wife were not on the title, she might have a claim. One of the reasons that you sometimes see deeds going from the grantor, a single man, or formerly married to so-and-so and now divorced pursuant to, and then they'll reference all of the papers. Does any of that sound familiar, Tom, as I'm saying it?
Yes, very much.
Okay, so the reason that is done is to trace the chain of title, to make sure that, in fact, that title insurance is not going to end up creating a lawsuit. Okay, now we have the situation where I'm going to say John Doe, a single man, grantor, hereby conveys to whoever, a single man, all that piece of property, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? John Doe wasn't a single man. Or if he's single now, he was married and his wife may or may not have a claim on that property, or he has children, or the property really wasn't to him, it really was to him and his brother, who both inherited it when his grandmother died 50, 60 years ago. You can see how convoluted this can get.
Yeah.
So that chain of title, particularly in jurisdictions where rules change, community property maybe once existed, but it no longer does. Death certificates may or may not exist. Title changes were never made. Property is still in the name of, person A, who's been dead for 2 decades, and now we have to find their heirs. So all of these potential complications are why it's critical to have title insurance. And as I was going through this, I am remembering that the individual through whom we met had a deal of this nature, and it took us 2 years to track down all of the heirs. And we had something like 12 signatures on a quitclaim deed that they quit claim any interest they had in that piece of property. And it took us 2 years to track down all of those people. So I think in today's world, those kinds of complications may not be as frequent, but they're there, and they represent a potential loss of your rights to a piece of property if you do not have title insurance.
So basically, always have title insurance, because the one time you need it will make up for all the other times that you bought it.
Absolutely. And again, as you had mentioned, this is paid for in most jurisdictions, but not all. It's paid for by the purchaser. In some jurisdictions, it's paid for by the seller. And I'm sure in some jurisdictions it's split. I'm not familiar with any of those, but I know that there are jurisdictions in which the seller pays for it. The state of Florida, for example.
Gotcha. And the main thing there is you don't have to worry about who pays for it. That's the job of the closing officer to do that.
Exactly.
Which is one of the reasons you want to make sure you have good people that follow the letter of the law, federal, state, and local. They follow the letter of the law to a T. That's
it in a nutshell.
I've always viewed it as kind of, I don't want to say hiding behind, but let's say standing behind your law degree, all those licenses, the need for them to be legally compliant. I've never taken a deed at a kitchen table. I never want to have anyone sign over property to me at their kitchen table. I always want to do it at the proper office of a settlement company, settlement agent. That way, I know it's done right, and all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and we are 100% legally compliant with every agency we need to be compliant with.
That's one of the reasons you're so good at what you do.
Well, thanks, Emily. I'm trying to think if I had any other questions for you. Mostly, is there any need to pay an attorney a big retainer, or can I just pay as I go?
That's a complicated question, and I wish I could give you a simple yay or nay. A lot's going to depend upon the nature of the seller's situations. In general, I would say, pay as you go. And actually, the wholesaler, him or herself, is not the one who is paying those bills. They get paid by the seller and the buyer for the closing fees, unless there is some really complex reason why there has to be a lot of legal fees. And the other piece to that, Tom, is if you retain me as your attorney, very specifically, just as your attorney, I cannot, in good conscience, act as a settlement agent, because a settlement agent's job is to enforce the terms of the contracts to make sure that they are complied with. Whereas my job as your attorney would be to represent your interests above all else. But when I'm sitting at a settlement table, my job is to represent the interests of the transaction, which means all 3 parties. It's tricky.
It is. Which is one of the reasons why we've always worked so well together, was because even though you were representing the transaction and making sure everything was done right, we tended to be in agreement that that's the way we wanted it done. And there were times where afterwards we would have a conversation about, what happened or why, or a different way of doing things, or things that would need to be added or adjusted to my contracts to make sure that we were properly and fully compliant.
Do my best.
Yeah, well, no, it wound up kind of spanning the best of both worlds. In fact, there was quick story on that one. There was one time where one of my buyers insisted on bringing his own attorney to settlement, and I was not settling with you that time. I was settling with somebody else. And then guess who walked into the room as my buyer's attorney? It was you.
Oh my gosh.
I thought, well, isn't this interesting that his attorney is actually my attorney, but I was conscientious at the time that your client in that case was him and not me. And so we went through that transaction. It was done. And I remember afterwards, when all was said and done, the transaction was fine. And we stepped out in the hall, and I said, now that you're off the clock, man, your client's a real pain in the butt to deal with.
Did I agree with you?
You smiled politely. And I didn't wind up selling to him again, just because it was.
Yeah, that must have been before I got to the place where I would say, if I don't think you're a good human being, or you're my kind of human being anyway, then I won't work with you anymore. But it wouldn't surprise me if I didn't work with that person again either.
Just the whole thing, it was one thing after another, and all the little demands, and I was, man. And then of all things, what I found very amusing was during that settlement, he took a very strong objection to one of the clauses in my assignment contract. Like, it really irritated him that I had this clause in there. And I was having a hard time not laughing, because the person that put that clause in there was you, Emily. Yeah. I'm thinking, well, of course it's well written. Your attorney wrote it. But I couldn't say anything at the time because I was being proper and polite. And then afterwards we had a good time.
Oh Lord, the things. What was it? That wonderful quote from I think it's Julius Caesar. The good men do, the evil men do lives after them. The good is oft times interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar.
Not bad. Well, look, we've covered a lot, and a bit of law lesson, and couple rabbit holes opened up, but I think we managed to define what they are. If some of the terms were technical, the benefit to a podcast format is, if you didn't understand something, if something was too technical, the listener can listen again. And because I think you gave fantastic information today, Emily. Thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome.
Fantastic. Emily, anything else we should add?
I think not. I mean, I'm sure, however, that as the people who listen hear it, it may generate ideas and questions in their minds. And that, I suspect, is one of the things you hoped for.
Oh, absolutely. Because happy to, those questions that come up, I tend to cover them in trainings. And it's helpful to see, it's helpful for other people to see questions that other people have, because most people wind up with the same questions in the end. Thanks, Emily.
All right.
Thanks, Emily. Nice meeting you.
For now.
Bye. Thank you very much, Emily, for an awesome discussion on the legal aspects of real estate wholesaling. As always, we'll have full show notes at gettractionpodcast.com. That's gettractionpodcast.com. Looking forward to talking to you guys again on the next episode. It's Tom Zeeb signing off.
Thanks for listening. Your next step is to visit gettractionpodcast.com. There you'll find all current episodes and a link to download a free copy of Tom's Deal Flow cheat sheet. Happy wholesaling!